Hi, and welcome to Chris's Evaluation podcast. So, Chris, in what ways does the opening sequence use conventions of a social realist film?
I think in terms of the storyline, it follows conventions of a social realist film, as it has aspects of working class, depression, struggle, and even homelessness in terms of my opening sequence. In terms of editing, I use flashbacks with distorted colour, which is something shown in the beginning of The Football Factory, a film which is also the social realist genre and uses this editing technique. In the beginning, it uses black and white in ways of a flashback, and this is included in mine in terms of distorted colour in the flashbacks midway through the opening sequence. The sound is also mainly a high-tempo soundtrack, which is common amongst social realist films.
Which ways doesn't it then?
You could also say that the sound doesn't follow conventions, especially in terms of the voiceover, as this isn't typically social realist. Many social realist films have an accent from their characters with a voiceover. Also, the sound is generally diegetic in terms of voices and dialogue in a social realist film. However, mine has a very short voiceover with no accent.
I'm Tim, and I'm an addict. It's lost me £4 and then another 4,000. It's lost me my house and my girlfriend. Now I live in the woods where no one can find me. Like I said, I'm Tim, and I haven't got a penny.
The location also with its lighting isn't particularly a location you would associate with social realist films, but I tried to do that to bring a more natural light to the scene.
Does your opening sequence represent a particular social group?
I would say it does in terms of it negatively represents males. Obviously the man is now homeless, and in terms of my synopsis, the man had come from a position of power beforehand. I think this represents negatively as it shows a man that wants it all but loses it all in the process. It represents the negative culture surrounding men, and is therefore a story of struggle and loss negatively based on a man.
What kind of media institution might distribute your opening sequence and why?
I think an institution such as Vertigo Films would be suitable to distribute my film. It produces and finances mainly UK-based independent films, and a recent example of that being The Firm. Their support for UK independent films would attract me, and hopefully my use of a social realist film would attract them, as many of Vertigo's films are social realism, such as The Football Factory.
Who would be the audience for your film?
Through the research that I carried out, I found out that an audience of 16 to 30-year-olds would be the most likely to view my film. This would generally be males as well, as social realist films generally attract males. Throughout the research, I found out that the struggle of a homeless character would appeal to this age group, as I asked many people. Of this age group, more than half of the people who said they'd be interested in the film would be males, and that's why I feel it would attract this audience.
How did you attract and address your audience?
Throughout pre-production, I carried out research, and over 80% of the people who I asked thought that a male character would suit the film best instead of a female character. My original animatic changed as I believed that drug references were no longer appropriate after the research, and that only homelessness would be a theme for my opening sequence. Originally I thought the voiceover would continue throughout the whole opening sequence, but after researching that through audiences, I found out that many thought it would be difficult to concentrate on all the different aspects of my opening sequence, and therefore I changed it.
What have you learnt about technologies from the process of constructing this sequence?
This was the first time I used many of the technologies that I did use constructing this opening sequence. I found out they were generally easy to use and made filmmaking a much easier process for independent or young filmmakers. The editing equipment I used, which was Final Cut, made editing a simple procedure. The soundtrack was created using GarageBand, a simple track making tool, and it was easier to adjust the soundtrack to fit my opening sequence through the adjustments I made through the editing process.
And looking back at your preliminary task, what do you feel you've learnt in the progression from it to the opening sequence?
I now have a far better understanding of filmmaking techniques.
And looking back at your preliminary task, what do you feel you've learnt in the progression from it to the opening sequence?
I now feel I have a far better understanding of filmmaking techniques. Before, I didn't understand shot types or editing techniques, but now they're easier to understand, and I'm able to apply them to my opening sequence in a much more effective way than I did to my preliminary task. Outside of techniques, I've learnt about the conventions of different film genres, which has in turn helped me to make a decision in terms of genre for my opening sequence, as I've realised what it realistically means in terms of production and what I can't do. I've also learnt that it's important to stick to a production schedule, as at times I didn't stick to mine, and therefore found producing my sequence more difficult than it should have been.
Thanks for listening to the Evaluation podcast, and goodbye.